name is Amber Johnson, and I will be discussing chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Deborah White's Aren't I a Woman? This book discusses the mythology of female slavery and how female slaves were categorized as either a mammy or a Jezebel. It describes the nature of female slaves and how slavery was far more terrible for women than men. Not saying that slavery for men wasn't bad, but women had it more terrible. We will also discuss the cycle of life that female slaves went through. During the slave period, men and women slaves did not characterize things as masculine or feminine. Men and women did the same job, except women bare children and had to care for the children without the help of a man. Deborah White has written, "The source problem is directly related to what is and still is the black women's condition. Few scholars who study black women fail to note that black women suffer a double oppression that is shared by all African Americans and that is shared by most women. Every economic and political index demonstrates that black women's virtual powerlessness in America's society at large. A consequence of the double jeopardy and powerlessness is the black woman's invisibility. Much of what is important to black Americans is not visible to whites, and much of what is important to women is not visible to men." Chapter 1 is titled Jezebel and Mammy, the mythology of female slavery. Very often, when women were being auctioned off, their bodies were exposed and handled to by potential slave buyers to determine their capability of childbearing. Slave buyers sometimes kneaded women's stomachs to determine how many children a woman could have. Jezebel and Mammy were two categories that slave women were added into by whites. Many Southerners were able to embrace both images of black women and could switch from one to the other on the context of their thought. A Jezebel is a woman who is obsessed with matters of the flesh, and a mammy is asexual. A Jezebel could be described as one who was a slut at heart, and a mammy was one that is deeply religious. A mammy was a woman who could do anything and do it better than anyone else. The mammy of a slave house was the premier house servant, and all others were her subordinates. Mammy took care of her master's children and protected them. Chapter 2 is titled The Nature of Female Slavery. Male and female slavery was different from the very beginning. Women who were enslaved and wanted to escape failed to do so or died doing so. Women who wanted to run away had trouble because they had children and a husband who they didn't want to leave behind. And if they took the children with them, they died or got caught because of the children's cries. It was much harder for a man to find a wife than for a woman to find a husband, because there were many more male slaves than female slaves, because that was the type of slave that was being imported most. Men and women had sex-segregated living quarters, and children were raised by their mothers alone and with the help of other women. Female slave bondage was not better or worse, or more or less severe than male bondage, but it was different. Female slaves had to cope with the sexual abuse from very many people who they had come across. Chapter 3 is titled The Life Cycle of the Female Slave. The life cycle of a female slave was not a pleasurable one. For slave girls, childhood was neither carefree nor burdensome. Children lived in an age-segregated world. The children's world was not segregated by sex. Boys and girls were constantly together, and they engaged in all of the same activities. Black girls in the plantation spent most of their time in a sexually integrated atmosphere. The parents of these slave children wanted their children to learn to walk the tightrope between the demands of the whites and expectations of the blacks, without falling too far in either direction. In pre-adolescence, girls turned in their shirts for dresses and boys received pants. During the teen years, girls were integrated into the workforce, and role separation became a strict regulation. From age 12 to 16, slaves were included in the group called the trash gang. This group was assigned to rake stubble, pull weeds, or do light hoeing. At harvest time, they picked cotton. The next life stage is womanhood, where young women start to bear children. A lot of young women did not have knowledge about the reproductive system and where the baby would even come out of, because their mothers kept them uneducated about reproduction. Infertile women were treated like barren souls and passed from one unsuspecting buyer to the next. When women were pregnant, they became dependent upon other women and not men. Childbirth was handled exclusively by women, and children were raised by their mothers with the help of elderly women and other women. During the end of childbearing years, the slave woman's status in the slave community seems to have increased with old age. Senior women were put to work spinning and weaving, or sewing, or caring for children. In addition to caring for the children, older women also served as folk doctors. Deborah White has written, "At no stage in her life cycle was the plantation slave immune to the brutality of the system, and yet most women enjoyed the love and companionship of other slaves throughout their lifetime. Most knew the excitement of courtship and the joys of motherhood."
My name is Ashley Harris, and I will be discussing chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Arnt, a Woman by Deborah White. Chapters 4 and 5 each cover a different outlook of the female slave life, while chapter 6 discusses the life of black women after slavery was abolished. Chapter 4 is titled The Female Slave Network, and that discusses how female slaves supported each other during slavery. White women rarely did field work, and if they did, it was only temporary. It was greatly frowned upon for women to do hard labor, so the fact that they had black women doing the same hard labor as men shows they didn't view them as women. Black women who were assigned the same responsibilities, whether that be working in the house or in the field, they spent much of the day with each other. So in a way, black women formed their own culture. To separate black men from the women when it came to field work, they typically had men plowing, while the women hoed, which consisted of using a blade that destroyed weeds. When female slaves got pregnant, they were assisted by other female slaves to help them throughout their pregnancy, as well as delivering the baby. After giving birth, they were expected to go right back to work and raise their children at the same time, which was almost an impossible task because they worked from sunup to sundown. But because they had help from elderly slave women, their children were provided for. Also, when black women became ill with things like toothaches, colds, fevers, headaches, or backaches, they were assisted by female slaves known to be midwives or doctor women, who assisted them by making soup or broth made from leaves or branches from trees. Age played a huge factor in slavery. If you were an elderly slave, you typically received immense respect from the younger slaves, because if you've gone a whole lifetime into slavery, it means you are experienced, have wisdom, or bear a large number of children. To end this chapter, female-to-female relationships were usually more important than female-to-male relationships. This is because in a female slave's lifetime, female friendships lasted much longer than if she had a husband or a son who most likely would be sold off or ran away. Chapter 5 is titled Men, Women, Families, and this is about the relationships between female and male slaves and the families they created. If male slaves outnumbered the females, there was always continuous competition to win over the attention of the female. Some males even traded in the possibility to escape to freedom for the love of a woman. For example, and I quote, "Henry Bibb was such a man. Before he met Melinda, the woman he married and had a daughter with, he was bent on fleeing the South and slavery. But Melinda's affection temporarily supplanted his ultimate dream of freedom, and for a long while he was satisfied to be the object of her attention and the father of their daughter." Some men even married abroad, meaning their wives would be located on different plantations than theirs. They would only get to see them once a week, depending on how far away these plantations were located from each other. But then there were some men who never wanted to get married, due to the hardships that they would face having a wife and child in slavery, like the possible chance of never seeing them again if he ever got sold off. Sadly, marriage did not stop women from getting raped or whipped. Their husbands had to sit aside and watch their wives get abused, because if they stepped in, they ran the possible risk of getting beaten themselves or maybe even killed. Female slaves also had to fear the possible chance of separation due to their husbands being sold off, and if that happens, they are then assigned another husband. Overall, families were important to slaves because it made them feel like they had a purpose outside of what their slave owners assigned them. Chapter 6 is titled From Slavery to Freedom, and this is life for black women after slavery. The Civil War brought hopes of freedom for slaves. Freedom for black women meant, and I quote, "not working for white men who could beat and rape them, It meant being able to raise and care for their families, especially their children, away from abusive white masters, mistresses, and overseers. Freedom meant moving around at will and owning one's own labor. It meant being able to do, act, dress, and say what one wanted, and above all, it meant having the protection of the law. Even though slaves were ready for the challenges that freedom offered, the rest of the nation was not ready to respect their citizenship. Slave owners were not ready to give up their slave bondage, especially to the women they saw as family. It was always harder for women to escape from slavery than men, but when the war started, women made it a mission to escape to Union Army lines, like Fort Monroe, for example. Even though some owners were good to their slaves, the one thing that slaves enjoyed the most about freedom was that they were able to come and go as they please, without the permission from their owners. They wouldn't truly feel free if they chose to stay with their masters. But some slaves did stay with their owners because they didn't know where else to go or what else to do. To them, that was their home, and that's where they thought they belonged. Some women left immediately in search for their children and husbands who were sold away, but most learned the hard way that their loved ones died years ago. Lots of black women left their husbands they were forced to marry in slavery to be independent and prove that they didn't need a man to be a woman. And as time went on, black women ranked amongst the hardest working women in America. To write this book, Deborah White gathered primary sources from people who were either slaves at the time, had been slaves at one point, or had encountered slaves directly. Before this book was published, the experience of black women went largely unnoticed. White had hoped that recovering some history of American black women, that it would help them understand their lost identity.